Good morning. Hope your Saturday is off to a great start. What does it mean to fail? Why do we fear failure so much? Why is that word even part of the lexicon? I don't know, but we're going to talk about that a bit today. So put on the brakes, grab a cup of coffee or whatever you like to drink. Try not to spill it on your keyboard and join the conversation because it's time once again for Coffee Breaks with Steve. I want to tell you a little bit about our guest who is returning. You've probably been here. If you're a regular to Coffee Breaks with Steve, you have been here when she has joined us in the past. Just a wealth of wisdom and information about so many things. And her background really provides a basis for that just as much as her own experience. But Lisa Steele is Executive Director of Medical Simulation at Pacific Northwest University. She has more than 10 years of experience, I think several more than that by now, of experience directing medical simulation centers and operations, clinical background as a nurse and in public health, is currently working on completing her doctorate in business with an emphasis in organizational leadership, and that's one of her areas of expertise. A key facet in Lisa's career is coaching and advancing students, colleagues, the team she supervises and manages, and others, including taking on tough situations to invoke necessary change. And boy, you talk about overcoming failure. There's a prime example of how we do that, or the perceptions of failure. Lisa is always up for a challenge, gravitating towards roles that require process improvement, change management, and I love this phrase, and like Mary Poppins, moving on to the next person in need once her job is done. So would you please join me in welcoming back to Coffee Breaks with Steve, our good friend, Lisa Steele. Hey, Lisa.
Hi, everybody. I have to give Shalane credit for Mary Poppins. It really was her and the team that pulled that one off.
Is that right? They recognize
Yeah.
that feature about you. Lisa, it really is a topic when we start talking about failure. First of all, I almost dislike the fact that the word itself is in our vocabulary. I think because of the connotative emphasis that we have learned to put on that from a fairly young age. You know, it affects us when we're for most people in school situations, starting from the beginning. You know, your grades can represent success or failure. Comments and reactions from teachers and even from peers can either make us feel as though we're a success or a failure. And it seems that those are just almost black and white polarizing words. And to me, it seems like we could come up with different ways to think about the process of learning to progress. And I guess the first question is, why do you think we fear failure so much? And how does that concept of failing lead us to a point of having a fear of taking risks, both in business situations and just in life in general?
Sure. And I think that, so I look at failure and mistake, right? We treat the failure as the concept of a mistake. A mistake is so much easier to make and we're able to move on from it, but failure is this label. And anybody who knows me knows labels are not my thing. We have self-proclaimed labels now, and it gives us permission to live wherever we do. So I think we fear failure, not mistake that's made along the way. It's the outcome, it's the impact, it's the feeling, it's the, well, if I fail this, I'm not going to be able to achieve XYZ. When I talk to students, leaning into my medical side, when I talk to students, I would love to know one person who becomes a healthcare professional that's not going to make a mistake in their life. I don't know who that is because we're human. Somebody's going to make a mistake at some point, and they're going to fail something along their way to becoming a doctor. So the very first thing I ask them in the classroom is, how many of you like failing? And you can imagine the number of hands that do not.
A bunch of hands go up, right?
Yeah. And maybe you think you're never going to fail something on your way on this journey. And they all stop and think about it a lot more. And I said, I want you to think something you're really good at. So really don't care. And they glow. I mean, you guys probably all thought of something yourselves. And there's just that glow because there's this thing you're really good at. It's the matter. Right? Well, we're willing to take that fall, take that spill, make that mistake, struggle, because we know, because the next question I ask him, how many did it perfectly the first time? We'll tell on occasion I see that natural, wonderful person that knows how to do it and never failed in life. And my answer is, then you're going to have a harder road learning to fail. So
and
it's
Lisa,
not
let me let you know, I just wanted to interrupt you for a second, let you know.
Failed.
I'm just going to let you know we are losing some audio on you, and I didn't know it would be fine if you want to kill video just to make sure that we continue the bandwidth on the audio, because it was breaking up just a little bit. I'll leave that up to you.
Let me see if we can do that, and if that will help.
All right, I'll let you
know.
We'll
give
but
it a
please
shot.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the biggest mistakes that we make is, do we ever take the time to actually teach people how to fail?
Yeah.
What a concept. Have any of you ever been taught how to fail?
No, I wasn't. I mean, in my mind, Lisa, there's this thought process that again, failure sort of it represents an end of the road, an end point as opposed to a learning point. And one of the things I thought of the other day is, when we're looking at an infant or a toddler who's just learning new things, think about a baby who's just learning to get up and stand and walk. And those first steps, they fall down a lot. And do we ever say, oh, they failed? No, we recognize the effort. We recognize the progress. We recognize that is a move toward that ultimate success. And yet, as life progresses, we do tend to think about those missteps or those falling down moments as being a very negative defeat, I think, is a good word that often is synonymous with failure in our minds and in our souls. I mean, sometimes it just takes all of the motivation out of us. I like the fact that John Maxwell, leadership guru and expert, used to have writings where he would encourage us to fail forward, which in and of itself sounds like an oxymoron, because we think about failing, we think about stopping or lack of progression, and forward is a word that denotes progression. And I'm just wondering how you think about that concept of failing forward, or the idea of failing to failing to succeed. What are some of the things that come to mind when you think of that?
Yeah, so it goes back to that same analogy. I love that you can hear my dog, Shalane. I came inside to see if that would help with the audio, and I have them inside. So, of course, by the way, speaking of my dogs, Bella's birthday was yesterday. She was a St. Patty's baby, but I actually was delivering a litter of 14 puppies on St. Patrick's Day about 8 years ago now. Holy cow. So don't do it. It's a bad plan. But I think it goes back to when we think about teaching someone to fail. What is the definition of failure? And when I think of the definition of failure, it's failing to meet a set of outcomes, whether those are personally defined by a company, defined by ourselves, defined by somebody else. That varies, but the actual failure point is the failure to reach an outcome. So in my eyes, the only way to truly fail is to not continue persisting to reach the outcome. Mm-hmm. So you don't teach failure. When I think about that concept of teaching how to fail, you teach resilience. You teach learning the success in the moment. You teach how to take a topic and learn a lesson from it. I made the comment to a colleague last week, I think it was, when we have a barrier that comes up, we often look at it and say, well, there's no way I can persist through this barrier. Well, we haven't even tried. So, of course, you're not going to persist if you haven't tried yet. But what I shared with him is I don't often even stay on the same game board. I will switch games that I am essentially working or playing or operating in within my workplace to achieve the outcome that I'm trying to hit, because there's not one way to do it. So if we teach flexibility, adaptability, resilience, all the building blocks to be able to fail, persist, and move through, I think that's that concept of fail forward, fail faster. Because that piece of how many of you can think of that thing you do wonderfully? How many times did you fall flat on your face before you did it wonderfully?
Yeah.
And oftentimes we're willing participants in our failure when it's something that matters to us, when it's something that's valuable to us, when it's something that's worthwhile to us. So maybe we're choosing the wrong things to dedicate our time to, and therefore the failure is very painful.
Yeah, I have a question here. I think is worth asking. This one came from Georgie asking: do you think the fear of failure is bigger for people who are competitive?
Yes and no. I think depends on if you look at competitive as personal, internal competition. So I'm probably the most competitive person I know if we talk from an internal perspective. But I have no fear of failure because the only person I'm failing is myself. And I know that I have capacity to step forward and keep going. But if you're externally gratified, so more than even just competitive, if you're externally gratified, how you're viewed by someone else, yes, I think the fear of failure is even stronger at that point because, oh my gosh, I'm not putting my best foot forward.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I think there's also an aspect of this. It does come back to things with, hey, there you are again, with personality, in that, I mean, like, I know that part of my personality, and she'll answer, that this was inherited someone, is being a people pleaser. There is an element of the way that I have always operated that I will get down on myself if I feel that I've let someone else down. It may or may not even come from input or reaction from that person or from those people. But if I feel that somehow I let them down, I carry that. And, we talked about the fact that it is much easier for us. We play those old tapes, and it's much easier to hang on to the moments that we felt that we didn't succeed at something, that we let someone else down, that we let ourselves down. And we will hang on to those failure memories much more deeply and much more readily than we do the progress along the way, the success. And I am going to toss this out there and, get your feedback on this. But I think sometimes we need to train ourselves to be at that point and maybe surround ourselves with people who will help us say, look where you've come from. Look at how far you've come when we're talking about work situations, school situations, life situations. I know we've talked to our kids who've gone through trying to finish college at a later point in life than starting when they were 18 and finishing when they were 22. They had to go back and start, and trying to do that as part of a process of that intersecting with working full-time, being a full-time spouse, being a full-time parent. And they're trying to work all that in, and they're going, I don't feel like I'm ever going to finish this. Is look at what you've already accomplished. And I think we need those times, right?
Yeah, so you've hit a few different topics that I think are amazing. The one you just left off of, I call it negative gap analysis. It's actually a part of assessment when you're trying to find gratitude in what you've done or what you've accomplished. We are so good at looking forward and seeing what we haven't hit yet. It's that concept, you'll overestimate what you can achieve in a year, you'll underestimate what you can achieve in 5. So look 5, don't look 1, because 1's going to be intimidating and you're going to put so much on you and you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
On the flip side, if you look backwards, maybe you haven't done as much as what you wanted to in that year. But golly, where did you come from 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago? Because you've made it a heck of a lot further than you could have ever fathomed.
Right.
So negative gap analysis, it's one of the pieces that I would say is huge for anybody who's feeling those feelings of failure. Look backwards, not forwards. Give yourself that time to appreciate where you were. The other piece with people pleasing, getting someone to recognize that giving someone what they want is not what they need.
Yes.
Is a heck of a
Absolutely.
concept.
Absolutely.
So sometimes we give that surface level people pleasing components that are so crucial to your feelings of well-being and value and worth. But in reality, when I make someone look backwards, and Shalane knows, yelp, when I make you look backwards at it and really ask yourself, but is that person in a better place? Is that person growing? Is that person forward movement expecting, or are they stuck? We really realize that our surface level pat ourselves on the back and realize people pleasing is one quality. How many of you know you have a quality that you go, yeah, I did that thing that felt real good? We get stuck in feelings, and those feelings are what really cause us to get stuck in failure, or feelings of failure, or fear of failure. But when we actually look at the outcome, we realize it's not nearly as bad as you thought it was going to be.
I think there is a point here to be made for the fact that there are certain types of failure that have longer term consequences. The extreme of that is, you talked about working with people in the medical profession. There are circumstances where someone in the medical profession, or someone in other care situations, first responder situations, can fail in some capacity. It could be a failure of commission or a failure of omission that actually leads to someone dying. I mean, you hear that saying about that which does not kill us makes us stronger. That's great, but there are things that kill us. And I mean, that's the extreme. The ultimate example of our play on words for the title of this episode is from Apollo 13, not just the movie, but the real life situation where the man in charge of mission control, when they were trying to work through the problem, said, failure is not an option. We need to figure out how to make this succeed. And yet the entire reason that they did that was because a failure occurred, right? Correct. They had to work past a failure that had already happened and figure out, in a very dire time crunch, life critical situation, how to succeed. And there are situations that we may encounter that have longer term consequences. I mean, that's the extreme. The less extreme but still valid is, what about situations of failure that may actually lead to the loss of a job, expulsion from an education setting, the end of a relationship? And I think it's important to talk through the fact that we still have to figure out how to live past those times.
Right. Yeah. And I think, so again, so many different concepts. One, I think that concept of mistake versus failure, whether it's healthcare, whether it's Apollo 13, whether it's the broader scope of making it to space, etc. A failure, again, is the failure to achieve an outcome. So if you get into the minutia and make every healthcare worker believe that every mistake they make is a failure. No, the mistake they made was human nature. And we give so much grace. Gosh, talk grace. If you can relate or align or understand what somebody may have done, don't we give so much more grace for the failure than we do if we can't? That one kills me a little, because we have a lot of industries right now that are under pretty big pressures. And police force is one that I was into a middle of a conversation not long ago. I have a significant other that worked on the police force side. It doesn't negate my feelings of police brutality is not okay, but the system failure exists. The individuals operate within a scope of what they can, a scope of what they've been taught, a set and series of events that give them the ability to make an assumption to try to go home to their family. Yeah. And if you can understand that, then you look at it very differently as a mistake. Healthcare, obviously I work in it. I've lost patients. I've been hands-on giving compressions when I've lost patients. Yeah. There is nothing that makes that feeling of failure feel easier for me. I know I can logic and process through doing the right steps, but I'm still going to feel like I failed, and especially a 13-year-old boy that I lost. Those sit heavy, but you also hit that piece on the head of your failures sit heavier than your successes. We
Yeah.
learn from our failures, we learn from our mistakes. If you're willing to put the energy and effort in to do it, how many of us stop short of that? How many of us get stuck in the feeling, don't want to persist through that feeling, and therefore that would be what I would classify as the failure. We failed because instead of learning from it, growing from it, doing better from it the next time, pushing towards that outcome we're trying to get to, we just stopped because it didn't feel good, because it was too hard, because it was too overwhelming. That's where I look at failure. So failure versus mistake, I think that's one to really break down a little bit. And, it's that, again, that resilience to push through. How do you learn to grow through something that was really tough? Well, first you have to acknowledge that it was really tough, and you have to look at it. And you know what? You can live in your feels, but stop after 30 seconds, because anybody can get stuck in their feels.
Oh, yeah.
Live there, be there 30 seconds, appreciate that feeling of what you'd experienced, and then stop and ask yourself, where do I go now? What is next? What do I do next? Big outcomes that come from, because that's the other piece you brought up. I lost a job. I can't get through my education. I've lived through some of these failures. Some of you may not know. I quit medical school, and that's not something that sits any less than feeling like a failure, because remember, my competition is internally and with myself. Every time I come up against a challenge at work that is challenged more because of my credential not being there, yes, I feel that failure. But I can choose to let that stop me in my tracks and no longer persist. Or I can recognize that doesn't negate my value. That doesn't negate my knowledge. That doesn't negate what I have learned. And I can push through that failure. I believe everything happens for a reason. And I think that's going to color everybody's perspectives on failures. What is your belief system? What are your values? What are your ethics? What things are you going to hold yourself accountable for? Self-accountability is huge. If I lose a job because I made a mistake, my first answer to anybody would be, I don't really want to work there.
Right. I went through one of those. Now, I had, several jobs in my career where there were those moments where the boss would call you in and you get a warning or you get a reprimand about something that maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a perception, and that's part of it too. Perception is reality, and that comes both internally and it can come externally. The only time I ever actually got fired from a job, I was only in the position for a few months. And it was one that, wow, I left a job that was very solid because I had this opportunity to step into a smaller organization as the executive director. And it was pretty clear from the outset that there were going to be some challenges in working with the board of directors for this organization because of the way it had been run previously. And that became more and more apparent as time went on. And several months into it, it was reaching a point where I really knew that it wasn't fitting well. And there was a board meeting, and I got an email at the end of the board meeting, after the board meeting, from one of the board members asking if I was available for a meeting the next day. And there's, you get those little pings going, okay, I have a funny feeling I know what's coming. And sure enough, they came in and told me, we don't feel like this is working out. Here's your termination. And the funny thing was, I knew it was coming. I already had my keys to the office on a separate key ring, had pulled out my corporate credit card, had my personal stuff boxed up. It was like, I knew it was coming. And there is still that sense of disappointment. There is a sense of, you still have a sense of loss. There is a grieving process for any time those things happen. But the bottom line was, I didn't go into a time of depression. I recognized almost even immediately some of the lessons that I learned. There are consequences for certain things, but part of the lesson that I learned was that I hadn't taken a firm enough stand on certain things with those people early on. I had, again, that idea of, I just want to get along, and I didn't press my position and take control of what my authority should have been. And the person who succeeded me in the job was someone I knew. and someone I continue to know as a colleague. And we met a few years later, had coffee together and talked about that and the difference in how we each approached it and why her situation ended up, she still had to deal with some of those same difficulties, but why her
Right.
situation became more of a long-term success, if you will, in that setting. And yet I still felt like I succeeded because of the lessons I learned, because of where it took me
Correct.
next, because it was still part of the journey to the next role and the one after that. And every, there is a saying, and I think this is true, Lisa, goes with everything we've been talking about. We learn more from our failures sometimes than our successes. The successes,
Hmm.
sometimes we can go into just autopilot because
Of
things are just
course.
rolling along smoothly. And it's those times when we hit those barriers, when we hit what sometimes feel like brick walls. They may just be speed bumps, but at the moment they feel like brick walls, that we can learn the greatest lessons from to take us forward so we can progress. Again, that baby trying to take the first steps, they have to fall
Right.
down in order to learn how to get up and try again, right?
Yes, and as a boss, you have to. So I'm seeing some chatter in the
Yeah,
chat that I'm going to use as a comparison right now because what I hear on your end, it's that, you know what, I'm not going to let this failure define me. I am
right.
going to learn my lessons from it. I am going to succeed through it. I'm going to take those lessons forward and do better. Now, that by no means negates the concept of failing to train your staff is a bad thing, right? You're going to pay for that. I assure you that the company paid harder for that than probably any employee that suffered through it. Long term, we don't always see those impacts because we're gone.
Yeah.
But it's real easy to go down that road of, and I'm going to point to the next comment, total failure on the employer's part. Yes,
Mhm.
I agree. I agree. And yes, and Shalann's going to laugh in the background here. Yes, and yes, it is a total failure on the employer part. And you have the potential to do a self reflection and ask, what could I have done different?
That's
That's
right.
the point we fail at. That's the point we fail at a lot because it's so much easier to live. And I want everybody to think of that because we've all had one of those moments that we just saw, right? Where we've been through something and it's so easy to live in that moment of justified. That's a
Hmm.
word. We should do one on justification. Justified. I am justified in feeling the way that I did. I don't hold the responsibility for what happened to me. As soon as you give away that permission to somebody else to control what happens to you, you've lost all control. That's, in my eyes, the ultimate failure because my success, my actions, my impact, my what I achieve in my life in the future, I no longer have any control of it
Yeah.
because it's what other people do, what other situations do, what other circumstances occur that give me the ability to achieve or not. That's
Yeah.
terrifying to me, by the way. That is a permission I will never give anybody else in my world.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to do and it's so easy to get roped up in there. The challenge I would give anybody is because we all feel that. I felt that. God knows Shalann's watched me live through that. Um, I look at it and I go, hold on, what could you have done different? Right. I have a 14-year-old daughter. Many of you may not know this. I have a 14-year-old daughter. I tell her all the time I could throw her off the roof most days. Love her to death, but good golly. We are at that phase in life. She asked me for permission. She's a very externally gratified child. Permission. My answer, I'm no longer telling you what you can and cannot do. I am telling you to make your choice. And I am telling you that when you make the choice, you own the consequence.
Yeah.
What a concept. When I say teach
Perfect.
how to fail, she's going to make mistakes and she's going to step wrong. And I will tell you the piece that I enjoyed watching most out of this, the sheer terror in her eyes when she realized the amount of self accountability and
Hmm.
responsibility that just fell on her shoulders. It wasn't that told me how far she's already grown
Yeah.
because it wasn't the opposite of, ooh, I get freedom. I get to do whatever I want to do. No, you get freedom of choice. Now, what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
It's that. How do you learn through it? So even in those two examples we just gave, you know, it's hard sometimes to look backwards and look at what you went through and say, well, yeah, they didn't do this part, but you know what? I could have done this. Those are the parts that are in your control. Don't let go of your control. If there's one best piece of advice I gave you, don't let go of the one thing you do have, which is control of yourself, your actions, your choices, your forward momentum.
Well, with that, because of time, that's, I think, going to be a great place to finish this conversation. Although, once again, we could have gone on for hours and maybe days or weeks. But I think we also set ourselves up for some things that we want to talk about the next time you're back, Lisa.
Always.
All right, Lisa Steele, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your insights, your expertise as always. And we'll certainly see you again here soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Yeah, so many things in that, so many, I think, valuable nuggets and things that on the one hand we go, well, yeah, that makes sense. And on the other hand, how do we apply those in our lives? That's the tough part sometimes, is application. I think about situations and even, some of the famous stories. You hear quotes, and I've seen different versions of this quote. I don't even know if he actually said it this way, but that Thomas Edison said that he had 1,000 attempts at making the filament light bulb before he succeeded at creating one that worked. And he said, I didn't fail. I found 999 ways not to make the light bulb, right? Whether that's a true story of something he actually said or not, what a great example of what we're talking about. You hear stories like that the people, the technicians or engineers who created, they were working on a new glue substance for 3M. And they couldn't get this glue to work right. But what they found was that it created a sticky but removable substance that became the basis for Post-it notes. Sometimes what we think of as failure in the moment is actually a success. Lisa talked about outcomes, a success towards something that we didn't even know was going to be the outcome, correct? So again, thank you, Lisa, for helping us get our arms around some of these ideas. So many more things to continue to think about. Hopefully, we'll have an opportunity to put some more thoughts and questions in the Coffee Breaks with Steve roundtable that you can look at. But as we get ready to leave, I do want to let you know what's coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, we're going to have another, I think, interesting conversation. That's one that's just kind of a social conversation. We're going to have a friend and someone who's an expert on manners and propriety and the things that we're supposed to do for politeness sake, and what is still valid and what has become passé in modern times. But Analia Young is going to join us and talk about what we should do and how we go about being polite in life and how our manners should interact in the 21st century. And then the following week, we're going to talk about identity a bit. Who do you think you are? Where does identity come from? This really is, even seems relevant with what we're talking about today. How often do we identify ourselves as a person with our do? Do we get our who from our do, or our do from our who? In other words, does our identity come from our actions and the things that we feel we're good at, or is our identity deeper than that? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then in 3 weeks, we're going to have, I think it's going to be very interesting. We're going to have a lady on she's an attorney, but she is also the keeper, one of the keepers of her sister's legacy. Her sister, Sylvia Moy, who passed away a few years ago, was a composer, a songwriter who wrote many of Stevie Wonder's biggest hits for Motown, was very involved with Motown. And Sylvia passed away. Her sister, Celeste, is now one of the heads of a foundation founded in Sylvia's name. And they have this event that they have done for the last few years, and they've been in the midst of doing it now. The final is coming up in April, and it's a cover song contest where artists come in and sing covers of famous, particularly R&B, Motown types of songs. Celeste is going to be with us to talk about her sister's legacy, and about this contest. I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Do you have topics that you would like to see us discuss? Do you have guests that you would like us to bring on Coffee Breaks with Steve? I very much love to hear from you. This is your conversation as much as mine. So please take the time to let me know. Again, private message me. You can share it here in the chat even, or email me, and we can have a conversation about who you would like to see here to have conversations with. So please let me know that. And just want to quickly remind you again that we are podcasting as well these days. It's not live on the podcast, but within a day or two of these broadcasts, you can find our episodes on Spotify as both an audio and video podcast, as well as on Apple and Google Podcasts in the audio version only. But that's another place that you can refer people in addition to Facebook, and we're on YouTube as well. It's very easy to find the Coffee Breaks with Steve channels on all of those platforms. And just remember that we record these so you can also go back later or refer people that you think might benefit from what we're talking about. You got to know people who you think there was something that we talked about today with Lisa that you would say, oh, I know somebody who needed to hear that. Share this with them. Direct them to the site. I'm not looking to become famous by getting thousands of people to watch Coffee Breaks, but there are people who need to be a part of the conversation as well. So please do that. And just once again, I just want to encourage you as you think about some of these lessons learned to find these ways to work toward the outcomes, find ways to learn the lessons that we all need to learn from those moments when mistakes are made. And as I remind you every week, please find a way to make a difference in your world this week. God bless you. Have a great week.